The dark corridors. Vera had always considered herself a logical person, someone who didn't believe in mysticism or the supernatural. She was rational and always sought a scientific explanation for everything that happened in her life. But all of that changed when she found herself in that house. After the death of her grandmother, Vera inherited an old abandoned house in a small town. It was one of those forgotten villages where time seemed to have stopped. Vera decided to go there to sell the house and finally rid herself of an inheritance that brought her nothing but unpleasant memories. Her grandmother had always been a stubborn woman and never told her much about the family, but Vera was certain that there was nothing strange about this place. When she arrived, she was met by silence. The house was located on the edge of town, surrounded by abandoned buildings that seemed to have stood there for centuries. It looked even more eerie than she had expected. Old windows with chipped paint, a rotting door, and dark narrow corridors inside where the air was stale and heavy. But something about the house was especially sinister. Vera felt it the moment she stepped over the threshold. The house was filled with a strange silence, broken only by the soft sound of her footsteps creaking on the floor. Her eyes fell on an old photograph sitting on a table in the entryway. It was of her grandmother and grandfather, and in the corner, barely visible, were two children. The children's faces were distorted as though they were looking into the void. Vera thought it was just an old photo and put it back on the table, but something made her stop. She couldn't shake the feeling that their eyes in the photo were watching her. She decided to continue her inspection of the house, trying to convince herself that it was just old things and random associations. But the more she explored the rooms, the stronger her sense of unease became. As she passed one of the doors, she heard something strange, barely audible rustling. Vera froze. It could have been anything. Old pipes, rats, maybe just her imagination. But the further she went, the more strange things began happening. In one of the hallways, a door closed on its own behind her, and when she tried to open it again, she felt an invisible force holding it shut. She yanked it open, but the room inside was nothing but darkness and the smell of mold. When she returned to the living room, she noticed that the photo on the table was turned over. Vera hesitantly approached and flipped it over, this time finding not only the old photo, but also a strange letter underneath it. The handwriting was familiar. She recognized it as her grandmother's, but it was a letter she had never seen before. "Don't believe those who tell you it's safe. They come when you're alone. They will see you, and you won't escape." Vera's heart raced. Who were they? She began to feel a cold creeping up her spine. This wasn't just a random letter. It was a warning. That night, in the silence as she was about to lie down to sleep, she heard something. Soft footsteps, muffled, as though someone was moving through the house without a sound. Vera froze in the darkness, listening. The footsteps grew closer. The moment she decided to get up and check what was happening was the most terrifying. Vera stepped into the hallway, where she was greeted by pitch-black darkness. Then, at the far end of the long corridor, she saw it, a figure. At first it was barely visible, but with each passing second it became clearer. It was the face of a boy. He stood motionless in the dark. Her heart skipped a beat when she realized it was the same boy from the photo. But now his face was twisted in terror. He didn't move, his eyes hollow. Vera took a step back, but then she heard a whisper, as if someone were whispering directly in her ear. "You can't leave. You've become one of us. We're all here. We've all come back." The voice was strangely familiar, and it was at that moment Vera understood. This house was not just an empty building. It was alive. It knew who she was. It knew her name. It knew everything, and the boy wasn't the only one. Suddenly, she felt the cold grip her chest. All the walls began to tremble, and the darkness around her grew thicker. The ghosts from the past began to manifest in every room, as though the sky and earth had collided, and all she could hear was their agonizing scream. "You'll be here forever," all the voices whispered together. Vera tried to run, but her legs felt like they were glued to the floor. The darkness pressed in on her, the very air heavy with malice. She was trapped in the corridor, and before her, the faces of her grandmother and grandfather, along with the children from the photo, began to appear. Their faces were swollen, decayed, but their eyes, those eyes were filled with terror. "You won't leave," the shadow of her grandmother whispered. Vera tried to scream, but no sound came. All she could do was watch as the entities approached her. The only thing left was the feeling that her mind was slipping away and that she was becoming part of this nightmare. Now her face would look out from the photograph at someone else, and they would whisper their name, inviting them into these dark, dead corridors.